Hello, I'm Carol Ireland, CEO of Epilepsy Action Australia. Welcome to another episode of Ask an Expert. Today I'm here with Dr. Kate Riney and we're discussing a very important topic, childhood and epilepsy. Kate is a paediatric neurologist and epileptologist, currently working at Queensland's Children's Hospital. Thank you so much, Kate, for being here today. It's lovely to be with you, and this is a really important topic. I've got some questions today that I'd like to ask you, and I've also got some questions that our clients, patients, would like to ask you as well. So let me start with the effect of epilepsy on the brain, and in particular, does epilepsy affect a child's brain development?
So thank you, it's lovely to be here today, and that's a really big question to answer, so you've jumped right in at a good meaty question for me. I think probably the first thing to say is the reason children have epilepsy is there is something different about their brain. And it's the underlying difference in how their brain works that is the cause of why they may have seizures. But obviously if their brain has a difference, whether it is a genetic difference or a structural difference that produces the visible things that parents see, which is seizures, that difference in the brain itself can also affect how the brain works in other ways. So our brain is effectively the computer for the body. It controls everything that we do, from our thinking, our speech, our movement. And so it depends on what that underlying problem in the brain is as to whether the manifestation of that problem may be only epilepsy, and by that I mean seizures, or there may be other impacts on how the brain works and other ways in which the brain's functioning from a development perspective or a thinking learning perspective might be affected. So epilepsy itself is not necessarily the direct cause in most situations of how the brain is functioning from a development perspective, but usually there's the underlying cause of the epilepsy can affect both your development and epilepsy, and to a variable degree in different children.
Very complex, no doubt. What about the impact upon mood and behaviour in a child?
So mood and behaviour is just another function of the brain, really, and it's very complex, even more complex when we think about mood and behaviour, because mood and behaviour is an interaction between how your brain is working and your environment. So, we all have to manage, differences in our mood and in our behaviour in the world that we live in and in the environment that we live in. And of course, there are lots of external things in our environment, day-to-day stresses, our social relationships, how much sleep we've had, for us adults, how much caffeine we've had, that affects our mood and behaviour. So mood and behaviour is even more, there are many more factors involved in how final mood and behaviour may be. But of course, when a child has epilepsy, that is an uncertainty in their lives. Seizures can interrupt day-to-day life, can create some restrictions in what you can and cannot do, and how your brain works in terms of its underlying development, how it handles development. You develop an ability to manage your mood and behaviour, and if you've got some difficulties developmentally, you can be a little bit more susceptible to having challenges with developing your mood and behaviour, and of course that interacts with the epilepsy interrupting life and with the environment that you're then within and your family and generally living life. So mood and behaviour is even more complex in terms of all the factors that come together to impact on it than even just general development things like speech and language and learning.
So talk to us about some of those other developmental challenges that a child might face. You've just mentioned several then. What are the common things that a child with epilepsy might face?
So I think one of the really important things to know is that in fact there doesn't have to be a development or a learning problem for children with epilepsy. So recently the International Epilepsy Organisation has really categorised different types of epilepsies and made it very clear that some epilepsies have no impact necessarily on your thinking, learning and development. So some children will just have seizures and won't have big problems with learning and development, and that's really important to know because often for those children, the problem is that everybody's expecting that they have problems in that domain, and they may have restrictions or less expected of them, or even just that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of if people are expecting that they will have problems in that domain, that can have an impact on how those children develop. So it's really important to understand first if there are expected problems from the underlying cause of your epilepsy for your child, and to proceed forward with a lot of advocacy that they are normal children from that perspective if they don't have, if they're not expected to have thinking and learning problems or developmental problems. And the different causes of epilepsy will separate out whether a child is expected to have problems with their development or not. So, but it is certainly true that some causes of epilepsy can have a risk to your development, and development is everything really. It's your ability to, learn to walk, how coordinated you are if you're walking, how well you're learning, how well you're communicating, which is our speech and language. We do a lot of verbal communication, but we also do a lot of non-verbal communication. We're reading people's expressions, and a lot of our communication is non-verbal. So all of those aspects of how we function in life fall under that broad category of development. And some causes of epilepsy also can have a greater or lesser extent an impact on development, and it's a wide range of things. It could be very mild, it could be more significant for some children depending on the underlying cause of their epilepsy.
And obviously parents are concerned about what this long-term effect might be. So for some children, is there a long-term impact on their academic abilities and their social abilities?
For some children, yes, not all children. And so yes, I think that's obviously the two biggest worries I think often for parents are, first of all, the seizures themselves. And there's a lot of uncertainty about when a seizure, it's unpredictable when a seizure might happen, and just managing the seizures. The seizures are sort of the big medical emergency, the big event when they happen. But then also there's the chronic day-to-day, how your child is functioning. And that's, that can be in its milder forms, very mild impacts on how you're doing with your thinking and learning when that gets really hard. And that can be in high school when the academics get harder and your need to function as an adult really require far more complex brain function. So in its milder forms, we may not know until children are grown up as to what their final ability to do those functions are as they're older. But obviously we're watching closely for children, how they're doing in school, whether their attention and concentration can be a problem in school. Their social relationships, how well they're managing those, because they're quite a complex function of your brain. And obviously more significant problems will usually present earlier, even before children are in school. And then there's a process of keeping things on watch at that point, and there are services that do help monitor children, look at how they're going with those aspects of their development leading into primary school, and just really supporting them with what those children may need as they do those educational transitions.
Sure. Kate, what about a child who's prone to having cluster seizures? Are they at greater risk of having their development impacted?
Not so much cluster seizures versus other types of seizures. It's probably whatever the underlying cause of the epilepsy is that's going to be, it's really the cause. People often look at the seizures and think, what are the seizures doing to development? But actually it's the underlying cause. There are some children who have underlying causes that are the underlying cause itself. A good example would be sodium gene problems in Dravet syndrome, where that has a very direct impact on your development and learning. And those children do have cluster seizures, but the major determinant of how they're doing is really the direct gene problem and how that's affecting the brain. There are other children that have cluster seizures it can be a very small focal problem within the brain, and that doesn't have a wider impact, so the cluster seizures happen, but they don't add to the problem in terms of how your brain is developing.
Right, it's not the seizure type itself.
Correct, yes, correct.
I would think that early diagnosis and the best possible treatment would be very important in terms of preventing any kind of developmental delay. Would that be the case, Kate?
Yeah, yes, with some caveats. I think, as I was explaining, really it depends on what the underlying cause of the epilepsy is. The underlying cause, there's so many different types of underlying causes, but broadly, there are very broadly genetic causes, and then there are causes that relate more to the structure of the brain, how the brain is put together maybe before birth, or some problem that happened along the way, like a stroke. So I think that underlying cause will often have its predetermined impact on final outcome, and on top of that, seizures can appear as another consequence of that brain problem. There are some types of seizures that we definitely need to get on top of early because they can entrain a problem with more difficult to treat seizures if they are there for a while. And the early treatment of some kind of seizures definitely improves your epilepsy outcome, so you may be less likely to have treatment-resistant seizures into the future. But it's still a little bit tricky. Research hasn't necessarily shown us a very significant impact on outcome over the underlying cause of the epilepsy itself from time to treatment of seizures initially. People are really looking at that, but it isn't necessarily as clear that the treatment of the epilepsy is the major determinant of outcome cognitively and developmentally over the underlying cause again.
And what are the most common types of treatments for children with epilepsy?
So in this day and age, we have a large number of treatments, but it really comes down to what the seizure type is and what the cause is. So some underlying causes have very specific treatments right from the get-go. Some of the genetic epilepsies that we look after, there are some of the standard medicines we have to avoid and some specific treatment pathways. So it really comes down to having an underlying cause of your epilepsy identified early. And initially also the treatment decisions are based on your seizure type, whether you have seizures that start in one part of the brain and spread, or whether you have what we call generalized seizures, where seizures kind of can pop up and arise from any part of the brain or within big networks in the brain. Usually we start with the medicines that we've had for a long time. In general, we've got particular medicines that we use for focal seizures and other medicines that we use for generalized seizures. But really coming back again, in this day and age, we often get to the underlying cause early because that can help guide more targeted treatments that are specific to that cause.
So medication is obviously one of the frontline treatments. Some parents are worried about their child's cognitive and social development with medication. Do they have cause for concern?
So I think it is interesting because the big worry often that parents have is that this is a medicine that is working on the brain. And so that naturally leads to a lot of worry about it's going to have an effect on all brain functions. A lot of the medicines that we use are very specific to the mechanism of action of a seizure within the brain. So they're not designed to necessarily affect the normal little electrical messaging through nerves, but they are designed to stop what we call a hypersynchronized discharge, this kind of big explosion of electrical activity that relates to a seizure starting. So they're designed to stop that, but not necessarily impact on the normal transmission of electrical impulses through the nerves in the brain. And so that means that a lot of our medicines actually do not have overt or obvious effects on anything else, or at least for the majority of people. Some people may be sensitive to a particular medicine, but a lot of the medicines that we use, the frontline kind of common medicines that we use, in the majority of patients, they have no side effects. But of course we watch for side effects. Of course we're very careful about side effects, and we use medicines that have been used in millions of children around the world. So they're well they've got a history of lots of careful tracking of side effects, both in their original trials and then outside of that, as we've kind of gone through medical care and collected information on any common side effects. Side effects are interesting because parents don't often know that when side effects are written down on the side of medicine boxes, how they come about is when a patient is on, when a medicine is in a trial, all patients who are having a trial of that medicine, and it's usually in multiple centres around the world, have a regimented check-in where they're called and asked about side effects. And every side effect that is reported by any patient in the trial over the entire duration of the trial is recorded as a side effect. So when side effects get listed on medicine boxes, everything that happens to a patient over maybe a 6-month period is recorded as a side effect, and that's just the safest way doctors have of identifying all potential side effects. But of course they can be coincidental. So when you look at things on side effect lists, you might see viral illnesses, fevers,
a very long list.
A long list, dizziness, yes. Sleeplessness, sleepiness, because if you were to call you or me over a 6-month period and check in on any symptoms that we were reporting, we'd probably over a 6-month period report some of these things. So doctors are used to knowing that these are common things that may happen to people over a period of time, but we also over time become familiar with what are the actual common side effects that we definitely see stand out in patients using those medicines. And so those are the things we're often looking for and will tell you about when we talk to patients and families about a medicine in clinic.
What about the longer term? Is there any concern about long-term use of medication? Any longer-term effects?
So there's a couple of very specific things in that category. The first thing to say is these medicines, some of the medicines we use have been around since the middle of the last century now, and for a period of time some of our common medicines that we use, the frontline ones, valproate and carbamazepine, have been around for, as I said, decades, and from a time when they were maybe the only medicines in the world for epilepsy. So they have been around a long time, and people have had them for a lifetime, very long periods of time. Probably the only thing is that some of the medicines can reduce your vitamin D levels in your blood, and that's been known to potentially increase your risk of osteoporosis when they've been used for a long time. But a lot of doctors will think about whether you have extra vitamin D during treatment with those medicines, just to protect you from that. Otherwise, really the side effects that you have are the here and now effects of the medicine, rather than necessarily an accumulated toxicity over time, because the medicines are cleared in real time. Don't accumulate. Once they're stopped, they're out of your system. So there isn't a concern for at least all the medicines that we have up to being used for decades now. We've got no significant concerns about long-term accumulated side effects.
Ah, good. And what about for children where the medication doesn't work to help control the seizures? What are the other treatment options that are available?
So, good question. There are other treatment options for sure. Again, it depends a little on the underlying cause. So, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, in 2023 we still have a number of underlying causes where we do have difficult seizures. And we know that we can use medicines and they may control things partly, but they may not get children seizure free. So some of our more difficult epilepsies, we do know that we can try some extra options that are not medication. The common things that we try are vagal nerve stimulator, which is an implanted pacemaker in the chest, and that creates a stimulation to the brain, and that can help seizures. And we've also got dietary therapies, the formal ketogenic diet that people will have heard about. Each of these treatments, they're not medication, but they have some risks like any other treatment and some benefits. And it's really about talking to a neurologist if you're thinking about those sorts of treatments. They can help. For some children, they can help significantly. But like for many of the medicines, when you've got a difficult epilepsy, they may not control things completely. So they may improve things, but maybe not always complete control. And for children that have very difficult epilepsy, it's a real balance of making sure we're not adding problems from treatment that is not helping, but also judiciously using treatment that at least gets things to the best overall quality of life for the child. And what I mean by quality of life, it's not always seizures and seizure count, it's how we are on our good days and how many good days we have and how much we're getting out of life on those good days. And so I think it's really important to have very much a bigger picture view of what we're treating and what our goals of treatment are when we have got an epilepsy that's not easily controlled with medication. We need to really get up in that helicopter and have a big picture view of the whole landscape. We need to look at, our goals of treatment being not always seizure and seizure count, but other measures of good life.
The best life possible.
The best life possible. And of course, there are some types of underlying causes where we can do surgery. Usually surgery for epilepsy is best sort of considered for people who have an area of the brain that is generating the seizures that can be safely removed. And that's very much a standard treatment for epilepsy. We do those operations at the Children's Hospital in Brisbane, several times a month. But it's not for everybody. It's only specific people who may have a type of epilepsy that will respond to a surgery. But of course, for those people, it can be very important because the surgery itself can solve the problem of the epilepsy, and that can mean a life without epilepsy and medication. So it is really important to consider: am I a surgical candidate? Is my child a surgical candidate? But it is not necessarily an option for a number of people with epilepsy.
Some big decisions in there sometimes.
Correct. Yes.